This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian Communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading the second half of Force, Violence, and Dictatorship in the Class Struggle, which originally appeared in Italian in our review Prometeo, numbers 2 and 4 of 1946, numbers 5 and 8 of 1947, and numbers 9 and 10 of 1948. The first half was presented in a previous video. 4. Proletarian Struggle and Violence. The first three parts of this work have briefly outlined the historical development of the class struggles up to present-day bourgeois society. They presented the perspective which Marxist socialism has long given on this subject, but which nevertheless continues to be an object of deviation and confusion. To clarify the question we made, the fundamental distinction between energy in the potential state, energy which is capable of entering into action but is not yet acting, and energy in the actual or kinetic state, energy which has already been set into motion and is producing its various effects. We explained the nature of this distinction in the physical world and extended it in a very simple way to the field of organic life and human society. The problem was then to identify violence and coercive force in the events of social life. We have emphasized that this is operating not only when there is a brutal physical act against the human body, such as physical restraint, beating, and killing, but also in that much larger field where the actions of individuals are coerced through the simple threat and under the penalty of violence. This coercion arises inseparably with the first forms of collective productive activity, and thus of what is considered to be civilized and political society. Coercion is an indispensable factor in the development of the whole course of history and in the succession of institutions and classes. The question is not to exalt or condemn it, but to recognize and consider it in the context of the different historical epochs and the various situations. The second section compared feudal society with bourgeois capitalist society. Its aim was to illustrate the thesis, which of course is not new, that the passage from feudalism to capitalism, an event fundamental in the evolution of the technology of production, as well as in the evolution of the economy, has not been accompanied by a decrease in the use of force, violence, and social oppression. For Marx, the capitalist form of economy and society is the most antagonist that history has presented until now. In its birth, its development, and its resistance against its own destruction, capitalism reaches a level of exploitation, persecution, and human suffering unknown before. This level is so high in quality and quantity, in potential and mass, in severity and range, and, if we translate it into the ethical literary terms which are not ours, in ferocity and amplitude of application, that it has reached the masses, the peoples, and the races of all corners of the earth. Finally, the third section dealt with the comparison between the liberal democratic and the fascist totalitarian forms of bourgeois rule, showing that it is an illusion to consider the first to be less oppressive and more tolerant than the second. If we take into consideration not violence as it is openly manifested, but instead the actual potential of the modern state apparatuses, that is to say, their ability and capacity to resist all antagonistic revolutionary assaults, we can easily substitute the blind, commonplace present-day attitude, one that rejoices because 2 world wars supposedly drove back the forces of reaction and tyranny, and replace it by the obvious and clear verification that the capitalist system has more than doubled its strength, a strength concentrated in the great state monsters and in the world leviathan of class rule now being constructed. Our proof of this is not based on an examination of the juridical hypocrisy or of the written or oratorical demagogy of today, which anyway are more revolting than they were under the defeated regimes of the Axis powers. Instead, it is based on the scientific calculation of the financial, military, and police forces, in the measurement of the frantic accumulation and concentration of private or public, but always bourgeois, capital. In comparison to 1914, 1919, 1922, 1933, and 1943, the capitalist regime of 1947 weighs down more, always more, in its economic exploitation and in its political oppression of the working masses, and of everyone and everything that crosses its path. This is true for the great powers after their totalitarian suppression of the German and Japanese state machines. It is also and no less true even for the Italian state. Although defeated, derided, forced into vassalage, saleable and sold in all directions, it is nevertheless more armed with police and more reactionary now than under Giolitti and Mussolini. And it will be even more reactionary if it passes from the hands of De Gasperi to those of the left groups. Having summarized the first three parts, we must now deal with the question of the use of force and violence in the social struggle when these methods of action are taken up by the revolutionary class of the present epoch, the modern proletariat. In the course of about a century, the method of class struggle has been accepted in words by so many and such various movements and schools that the most widely differing interpretations have clashed in violent polemics, reflecting the ups and downs and the turning points of the history of capitalism and of the antagonisms to which it gives rise. The polemic has been clarified in a classic way in the period of World War I and of the Russian Revolution. Lenin, Trotsky, and the left-wing communist groups who gathered in Moscow's International settled the questions of force, violence, the seizure of power, the state, and the dictatorship in a way we must consider as definitive on the theoretical and programmatic level. Opposed to them were the countless deformations of social democratic opportunism. It is not necessary to repeat our refutation of these positions, but it is useful to simply recall some points which clarify the concepts which distinguish us. Moreover, many of these false positions, which were then trampled to the ground and which seem to have been dispersed forever, have reappeared in almost identical forms in the working class movement today. Revisionism pretended to show that the prediction of a revolutionary clash between the working class and the defensive network of bourgeois power was an obsolete part of the Marxist system. Falsifying and exploiting the Marxist texts, in this case a famous preface and letter of Engels, it maintained that the progress of military technology precluded any perspective of a victorious armed insurrection. It claimed instead that the working class would achieve power very shortly through legal and peaceful means due to the development and strengthening of working class unions and of parliamentary political parties. Revisionism sought to spread throughout the ranks of the working class the firm conviction that it was not possible to overthrow the power of the capitalist class by force, and, furthermore, that it was possible to realize socialism after conquering the executive organs of the state by means of a majority in the representative institutions. Left Marxists were accused of a worship of violence, elevating it from a means to an end, and invoking it almost sadistically, even when it was possible to spare it and attain the same result in a peaceful way. But in the face of the eloquence of the historical developments, this polemic soon unveiled its content. It was a mystique, not so much of nonviolence, as it was an apology of the principles of the bourgeois order. After the armed revolution triumphed in Leningrad over the resistance of both the Tsarist regime and the Russian bourgeois class, the argument that it was not possible to conquer power with arms changed into the argument that it must not be done, even if it is possible. This was combined with the idiotic preaching of a general humanitarianism and social pacifism, which of course repudiates the violence utilized for the victory of the working class revolutions, but does not denounce the violence used by the bourgeoisie for its historical revolutions, not even the extreme terroristic manifestations of this violence. Moreover, in all the controversial decisions, in historical situations which were decisive for the socialist movement, when the right contested the propositions of direct action, it admitted that it would have agreed with the necessity of resorting to insurrection if it were for other objectives. For example, the Italian reformist socialists in May of 1915 opposed the proposal for a general strike at the moment of war mobilization, using ideological and political arguments, in addition to a tactical evaluation of the relation of forces. But they admitted that if Italy intervened in the war on the side of Austria and Germany, they would call the people to insurrection. In the same way, those who theorize the utilization of legal and democratic ways are ready to admit that popular violence is legitimate and necessary when there is an attempt from above to abolish constitutional rights. But how can it be maintained, then, that the development of military technology in the hands of the state is no longer an insurmountable obstacle? How can it be guaranteed, in the event of a peaceful conquest of the majority, that the bourgeoisie will not use those military means in order to maintain power? How can the proletariat in these situations victoriously use the violence which is criticized and condemned as a class means? The Social Democrats cannot answer this, because in doing so, they would be obliged to confess that they are pure and simple accomplices in preserving bourgeois rule. A system of tactical slogans such as theirs can in fact be reconciled only with a clearly anti-Marxist apology of bourgeois civilization, which precisely is the essence of the politics of those parties which have risen from the deformed slump of anti-fascism. The social democratic thesis contends that the last historical situation where the recourse to violence and to forms of civil war was necessary was precisely that situation which enabled the bourgeois order to rise from the ruins of the old feudal and despotic regimes. With the conquest of political liberties of an era of civilized and peaceful struggles is supposedly opened in which all other conquests, such as economic and social equality, can be realized without further bloody conflicts. According to this ignoble falsification, the historical movement of the modern proletariat and socialism are no longer the most radical battle of history. They are no longer the destruction of an entire world down to its foundations, from its economic framework and its legal and political system, to its ideologies still impregnated with all the lies transmitted by previous forms of oppression, and still poisoning even in the very air we breathe. Socialism is reduced to a stupid and irresolute combination of supposed legal and constitutional conquests by which the capitalist form has allegedly enriched and enlightened society, with vague social postulates which should be graftable and transplantable onto the trunk of the bourgeois system. Marx measured the irresistible and increasing pressures in the social depths which will cause the mantle of the bourgeois forms of production to explode, just as geological cataclysms break the crust of the planet. His formidable historical vision of social antagonisms is replaced by the contemptible deception of a Roosevelt, who adds to the short list of bourgeois liberties those of freedom from fear and freedom from need, or of a Pius XII, who, after blessing once again the eternal principle of property in its modern capitalist form, pretends to weep over the abyss which exists between the poverty of the multitude and the monstrous accumulations of wealth. Lenin's theoretical restoration of the revolutionary doctrine re-established the definition of the state as a machine which one social class uses to oppress other classes. This definition is fully and particularly valid for the modern bourgeois, democratic, and parliamentary state, but as a crowning point of the historical polemic, it must be made clear that the proletarian class force cannot overtake this machine and use it for its own purposes. Instead of conquering it, it must smash it and break it to pieces. The proletarian struggle is not a struggle that takes place within the state and its organs, but a struggle outside the state, against it, and against all its manifestations and forms. The proletarian struggle does not aim at seizing or conquering the state, as if it were a fortress which the victorious army seeks to occupy. Its aim, instead, is to destroy it, and to raze its defeated defenses and fortifications to the ground. Yet, after the destruction of the bourgeois state, a form of political state becomes necessary, i.e., the new organized class power of the proletariat. This is due to the necessity of directing the use of an organized class violence by means of which the privileges of capital are rooted out and the organization of the freed productive forces in the new, non-private, non-commodity communist forms is made possible. Consequently, it is correct to speak of the conquest of power, meaning a non-legal, non-peaceful, but violent, armed, revolutionary conquest. It is correct to speak of the passage of power from the hands of the bourgeoisie to those of the proletariat, precisely because our doctrine considers power not only authority and law based on the weight of the tradition of the past, but also the dynamics of force and violence thrust into the future, sweeping away the barriers and obstacles of institutions. It would not be exact to speak of the conquest of the state or the passage of the state from the administration of one class to that of another, precisely because the state of a ruling class must perish and be shattered as a condition for the victory of the formerly subjugated class. To violate this essential point of Marxism, or to make the slightest concession to it, for instance allowing the possibility that the passage of power can take place within the scope of a parliamentary action, even one accompanied by street fighting and battles and by acts of war between states, leads to the utmost conservatism. This is because such a concession is tantamount to conceding that the state structure is a form which is open to totally different and opposed contents, and therefore stands above the opposing classes in their historical conflict. This can only lead to the reverential respect of legality and the vulgar apology for the existing order. It is not only a question of a scientific error of evaluation, but also of a real degenerative historical process which took place before our eyes. It is this process which has led the ex-communist parties downhill, turning their backs on Lenin's theses and arriving at the coalition with the social democratic traitors, at the workers' government, and then at the democratic government, that is to say, a direct collaboration with the bourgeoisie and at its service. With the unequivocally clear thesis of the destruction of the state, Lenin re-established the thesis of the establishment of the proletarian state. The second thesis does not please the anarchists, who, though they had the merit of advancing the first, had the illusion that immediately after bourgeois power, smashed society could dispense with all forms of organized power, and therefore with the political state, that is to say, with a system of social violence. Since the transformation of the economy from private to socialist cannot be instantaneous, it follows that the elimination of the non-laboring class cannot be instantaneous and cannot be accomplished through the physical elimination of its members. Throughout the far from brief period during which the capitalist economic forms persist while constantly diminishing, the organized revolutionary state must function, which means, as Lenin unhypocritically said, maintaining soldiers, police forces, and prisons. With the progressive reduction of the sector of the economy still organized in private forms, there is a corresponding reduction of the area in which it is necessary to use political coercion, and the state tends to progressively disappear. The points which we have recalled here in a schematic way are enough to demonstrate how both a magnificent polemical campaign ridiculing and crushing its opponents, and, above all, the greatest event up to now in the history of the class struggle, have brought out in all their clarity the classical theses of Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, and the conclusions which have been drawn from the defeat of the Paris Commune. These are the theses of the conquest of political power, the proletarian dictatorship, the despotic intervention in the bourgeois relationships of production, and the final withering away of the state. The right of speaking of historical confirmations parallel to the brilliant theoretical construction seems to cease when this last phase is attained, since we have not yet witnessed, in Russia or anywhere else, the process of the withering away, the dying down of itself, the dissolving away, Auflösung in Engels, of the state. The question is important and difficult, since a sound dialectic can demonstrate nothing with certainty on the basis of a more or less brilliant series of spoken or written words. Conclusions can only be based on facts. The bourgeois states, in whatever atmospheres and ideological climates, inflate in a more and more terrible way before our eyes. The only state which is presented, through tremendous propaganda, as a working-class state, expands its apparatus and its bureaucratic, legal, police, and military functions beyond all limits. So it is not surprising that the prediction of the shriveling up and elimination of the state, after it has fulfilled its decisive role in the class struggle, is greeted with a widespread skepticism. Common opinion seems to say to us, "You can wait forever. You who theorize and pretend to realize red dictatorships. The state organ, like a tumor in the body of society, will never regress and will instead invade all its tissues and all its innermost recesses until suffocating it." It is this commonplace attitude which encourages all the individualist, liberal, and anarchist ideologies, and even the old and new deformed hybrids between the class method and the liberal one, all of which are served to us as types of socialism, based on a mere personality and on the plenitude of its manifestation. It is quite remarkable that even the few groups in the communist camp which reacted to the opportunist degeneration of the parties of the now dissolved International of Moscow tend to display a hesitation on this point. In their preoccupation with fighting against the suffocating centralization of the Stalinist bureaucracy, they have been led to cast doubts on the Marxist principles re-established by Lenin, and they reveal they believe that Lenin, and along with him all the revolutionary communists in the glorious period of 1917 to 20, were guilty of an idolization of the state. We must firmly and clearly state that the current of the Italian Marxist left, with which this review is linked, does not have the slightest hesitance or repentance on this point. It rejects any revision of Marx and Lenin's fundamental principle that the revolution, as it is a violent process par excellence, is thus a highly authoritarian, totalitarian, and centralizing act. our condemnation of the Stalinist orientation is not based on the abstract, scholastic, and constitutionalist accusation that it committed the sinful acts of abusing bureaucratism, state intervention, and despotic authority. It is based instead on quite different evaluations of the economic, social, and political development of Russia and the world, of which the monstrous swelling of the state machine is not the sinful cause, but the inevitable consequence. The hesitation about accepting and defending the dictatorship is rooted not only in vague and stupid moralizing about the pretended right of the individual or the group not to be pressured by or forced to yield to a greater force, but also in the distinction, undoubtedly very important, made between the concept of a dictatorship of one class over another and the relationships of organization and power within the working class which constitutes the revolutionary state. With this point, we have reached the aim of the present article. Having restated the basic facts in their correct terms, we of course do not pretend to have exhausted these questions, which is something that only history can do, as we consider it to have done with the question of the necessity of violence in the conquest of power. The task of the party's theoretical work and militancy is something other. It is to avoid, in the search for a solution to these questions, the unconscious utilization of arguments which are dictated or influenced by enemy ideologies, and thus by the interests of the enemy class. Dictatorship is the second and dialectical aspect of revolutionary force. This force, in the first phase of the conquest of power, acts from below and concentrates innumerable efforts in the attempts to smash the long-established state form. After the success of such an attempt, this same class force continues to act but in an opposite direction, i.e. from above, in the exercise of power entrusted to a new state body fully constituted in its whole and its parts, and even more robust, more resolute, and, if necessary, more pitiless and terroristic than that which was defeated. The outcries against the call for the proletarian dictatorship, a claim that even the politicians of the Iron Moscow regime are hypocritically hiding today, as well as the cries of alarm against the pretended impossibility of curbing the lust for power and consequently for material privilege on the part of the bureaucratic personnel crystallized into a new ruling class of caste. All this corresponds to the vulgar and metaphysical position which treats society and the state as abstract entities. Such a position is incapable of finding the key to problems through an investigation into the facts of production and into the transformation of all relationships, which the collision between classes will give birth to. Therefore, to equate the concept of dictatorship that we Marxists call for with the vulgar concept of tyranny, despotism, and autocracy means to cause a banal confusion. The proletarian dictatorship is thus confused with personal power, and on the basis of the same stupidities, Lenin is condemned just like Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin. We must remember that the Marxist analysis completely disclaims the assertion that the state machines act under the impulse of the will of these contemporary duces. These duces are nothing but chessmen, having only symbolic importance, which are moved on the chessboard of history by forces from which they cannot escape. Furthermore, we have shown many times that the bourgeois ideologists do not have the right to be shocked by a Franco, a Tito, or the vigorous methods used by the states which present them as their leaders, since their ideologists do not hesitate to justify the dictatorship and terror to which the bourgeoisie resorted precisely in the period following its conquest of power. Thus no right-minded historian classifies the dictator of Naples in 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi, as a political criminal, but on the contrary exalts him as a true champion of humanity. The proletarian dictatorship, therefore, is not manifested in the power of a man, even if he has exceptional personal qualities. Does this dictatorship then have as its acting agent a political party which acts in the name and in the interests of the working class? Our current answers this question, today as well as the time of the Russian Revolution, with an unconditional yes. Since it is undeniable that the parties which pretend to represent the proletarian class have undergone profound crises and have repeatedly broken up or undergone splits, our decidedly affirmative answer raises the following question. Is it possible to determine which party has in effect such a revolutionary prerogative, and what criterion is to be used to determine it? The question is thus transferred to the examination of the relationship between the broad class base and the more restricted and well-defined organ, which is the party. In answering the questions on this point, we must not lose sight of the distinctive characteristic of the dictatorship. As is always the case with our method, before concrete historical events reveal the positive aspects of this dictatorship, we shall define it by its negative aspect. A regime in which the defeated class still exists physically and constitutes from a statistical viewpoint a significant part of the social agglomerate, but is kept outside of the state by force, is a dictatorship. Moreover, this defeated class is kept in conditions which make it impossible to attempt a reconquest of power because it is denied the rights of association, propaganda, and the press. It is not necessary to determine from the start who maintains the defeated class in this strict state of subjugation. The very course of the historical struggle itself will tell us. For the class we fight to be reduced to this state of a social minority, undergoing this social death pending its statistical one, we will admit for a moment that the acting agent can be either the entire victorious social majority, an extreme hypothesis which is unrealizable, or a part of that majority, or a solid vanguard group, even if it is a statistical minority, or, finally, in a brief crisis, even a single man, another extreme hypothesis, which was close to being realized in only one historical example, that of Lenin, who, in April 1917, alone against the entire Central Committee and the old Bolsheviks, was able to read in advance the march of events and to determine in his theses the new course of the history of the party and of the revolution, just as in November he had the Constituent Assembly dissolved by the Red Guard. As the Marxist method is not a revelation, a prophecy, or a scholasticism, it achieves first of all the understanding of the way in which the historical forces act and determine their relationships and their clashes. Then, with theoretical research and practical struggle continuing, it determines the characteristics of the manifestation of these forces and the nature of the means by which they act. The Paris Commune confirmed that the proletarian forces must smash the old state instead of entering it and taking it over, and that its means must not be legality, but insurrection. The very defeat of the proletariat in that class battle and the October victory at Leningrad have shown that it is necessary to organize a new form of armed state whose secret is in the following. It denies political survival to the members of the defeated class and to all its various parties. Once this decisive secret has been drawn from history, we still have not clarified and studied all the physiology and the dynamics of the new organ that has been produced. Unfortunately, an extremely difficult area, its pathology, remains open. Above all else, its basic negative characteristic is the exclusion of the defeated class from the state organ, regardless of whether or not it has multiple institutions, the representative, executive, judicial, and bureaucratic. This radically distinguishes our state from the bourgeois state, which pretends to host all social strata in its bodies. Yet, this change cannot seem absurd to the defeated bourgeoisie. Once it succeeded in bringing down the old state based on two orders, the nobility and the clergy, it understood that it had made a mistake by only demanding to enter as the third estate in the new state body. Under the Convention and under the Terror, it chased the aristocrats out of the state. It was easy for it to historically close up the phase of open dictatorship, since the privileges of the two orders, which were based on legal prerogatives rather than on the productive organization, could rapidly be destroyed, and thereby the priest and the noble could rapidly be reduced to simple, indistinguishable citizens. In this section, we have defined what fundamentally distinguishes the historical form of the proletarian dictatorship. In the next section, we will examine the relationship among the various organs and institutions through which the proletarian dictatorship is exercised: class party, workers' councils, trade unions, and factory councils. In other words, we will conclude by discussing the problem of the so-called proletarian democracy, an expression that can be found in some texts of the Third International, but which it would be better to get rid of, which is supposedly to be instituted after the dictatorship has historically buried bourgeois democracy. 5. Russian degeneration and dictatorship. The difficult problem of the degeneration of the political power can be summarized briefly. In a large country, the working classes conquered power following the program which called for an armed insurrection and the annihilation of all influence of the defeated class through pressure of the proletarian class dictatorship. In the other countries of the world, however, the working class either did not have the strength to initiate the revolutionary attack, or else was defeated in the attempt. In these countries, power remained in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and production and exchange continued according to the laws of capitalism, which dominated all the relationships of the world market. In the country where the revolution triumphed, the dictatorship held firm politically and militarily against every counterattack. It brought the Civil War to a close in a few short and victorious years, and foreign capitalism did not engage in a general action to crush it. A process of internal degeneration of the new political and administrative apparatus began to develop, however. A privileged circle began to form, monopolizing the advantages and posts in the bureaucratic hierarchy while continuing to claim to represent the interests of the great laboring masses. In the other countries, the revolutionary working class movement, which was intimately linked to this same political hierarchy, not only did not succeed in the various overthrow of the bourgeois states, but progressively lost and distorted the whole sense of its own action by pursuing other non-revolutionary objectives. This terrible problem in the history of the class struggle gives rise to a crucial question. How can such a double catastrophe be prevented? The question actually is badly posed. For those who follow the determinist method, the question actually is one of determining the true characteristics and laws of this degenerative process, in order to establish when and how we can recognize the conditions which would allow us to expect and pursue a revolutionary course free from this pathological reversion. Here we will not concern ourselves with refuting those who deny the existence of such a degeneration, and who maintain that in Russia there is true revolutionary working class power, an actual evolution of the economic forms towards communism, and a coordination with the other proletarian parties of the world, which will actually lead to the overthrow of world capitalism. Nor will we concern ourselves here with a study of the socio-economic aspects of the problem, for this would necessitate a detailed and careful analysis of the mechanism of production and distribution in Russia, and of the actual relationships which Russia had with foreign capitalist economies. Instead, at the end of this historical exposition on the question of violence and force, we will reply to those critical objections which claim that such an oppressive and bureaucratic degeneration is a direct consequence of infringing and violating the canons and principles of elective democracy. This objection has two aspects, with the less radical being in fact the more insidious. The first aspect is overtly bourgeois, and is directly linked to the entire world campaign to defame the Russian Revolution. This campaign, which has been going on since 1917, has been led by all the liberals, Democrats, and Social Democrats of the world, who have been terrorized as much by the magnificent and courageous theoretical proclamation of the method of proletarian dictatorship as by its practical application. In view of what we have recalled in this work, we consider this first aspect of the democratic lamentation to have been refuted. The struggle against it, however, still remains of primary importance today, since the conformist demand of what Lenin called democracy in general, and which in the basic communist works represents the dialectical opposite, the antithesis and negation of the revolutionary position, is still disgustingly paraded by the very parties who claim to be linked to the present regime in Russia. This very regime, although making dangerous and condemnable concessions to the bourgeois democratic mechanism at home in the area of formal right, not only continues to be, but becomes increasingly a strictly totalitarian and police state. We will never insist enough, then, in our critique of democracy in all the historical forms in which it has appeared until now. Democracy has always been an internal method of organization of the oppressor class, whether this class is old or new. It has always been a technique, whether old or new, that is utilized in the internal relations among the elements and groups of the exploiting class. In the bourgeois revolutions, it was also the necessary and vital environment for the blooming of capitalism. The old democracies were based on electoral principles, assemblies, parliaments, or councils. While deceitfully pretending that their aim was to realize a well-being for all and the extension of the spiritual or material conquests to all of society, their actual function was to enforce and maintain the exploitation of a mass of fanatics, slaves, and helots, of whole peoples who had been submitted because they were less advanced or less warlike, of a whole mass of people excluded from the temple, the senate, the city, and the assemblies. We can read the truth within the multitude of banal theories referring to egalitarianism. It is the compromise, covenant, and conspiracy among the members of the privileged minority to the detriment of the lower classes. Our appraisal of the modern democratic form, which is based on the holy charters of the British, French, and American revolutions, is no different. Modern democracy is a technique which provides the best political conditions for the capitalist oppression and exploitation of the workers. It replaces the old network of feudal oppressors by which capitalism itself was suffocated, but only to exploit in a way which is new and different, but no less intense or extensive. Our interpretation of the present totalitarian phase of the bourgeois epoch is fundamental in regard to this point. In this phase, the parliamentary forms, having played out their role, tend to disappear and the atmosphere of modern capitalism becomes anti-liberal and anti-democratic. The tactical consequence of this correct evaluation is that any call to return to the old bourgeois democracy characteristic of rising capitalism is anti-classist, reactionary, and even anti-progressive. We will now take up the second aspect of this democratic critique. This aspect is not inspired by the dogmas of an interclass and above-class democracy, but instead says basically the following. It is well and good to establish the proletarian dictatorship and to do away with any scruples in the repression of the rights of the defeated bourgeois minority. However, once the bourgeoisie in Russia was deprived of all rights, the degeneration of the proletarian state occurred because the rules of representation were violated within the working class. If an elective system truly functioning according to the majority principle had been established and respected in the base organizations of the proletariat, the Soviets, the unions, and the political party, with every decision made on the basis of the numerical outcome of a truly free vote, then the true revolutionary path would have been automatically maintained, and it would have been possible to ward off any degeneration and any danger of the abusive, suffocating domination by the ignoble Stalinist clique. At the heart of this widely accepted viewpoint is the idea that each individual, solely due to the fact that he or she belongs to an economic class, i.e. that he finds himself in particular relationships in common with many others with respect to production, is consequently predisposed to acquire a clear class consciousness, in other words, to acquire that body of opinions and intentions which reflect the interests, the historical path, and the future of his class. This is a false way of understanding Marxist determinism, because the formation of consciousness is something which, although certainly linked to the basic economic conditions, lags behind them at a great distance in time and has a field of action that is much more restricted. For example, many centuries before the development of the historical consciousness of the bourgeois class, the bourgeois, the tradesman, the banker, and the small manufacturer existed and fulfilled essential economic functions, but had the mentality of servants and accomplices of the feudal lords. A revolutionary tendency and ideology slowly formed among them, however, and an audacious minority began to organize itself in order to attempt to conquer power. Just as it is true that some members of the aristocracy fought for the bourgeois revolution, it is also true that there were many members of the bourgeoisie who, after the conquest of power in the great democratic revolutions, not only retained a way of thinking, but also a course of action contrary to the general interests of their own class, and militated and fought with the counter-revolutionary party. Similarly, while the opinions and consciousness of the worker are formed under the influence of his or her working and material living conditions, they are also formed in the environment of the whole traditional conservative ideology in which the capitalist world envelops the worker. This conservative influence is becoming increasingly stronger in the present period. It is not necessary to list again the resources which are available, not only for the systematic organization of propaganda through modern techniques, but also for the actual centralized intervention in the economic life through the adoption of numerous reformist measures, and state intervention, which are intended to satisfy certain secondary needs of the workers, and which in fact often have a concrete effect on their economic situation. For the crude and uneducated masses, the old aristocratic and feudal regimes needed only the church to fabricate servile ideologies. They acted on the rising bourgeoisie, however, primarily through their monopoly over the school and culture. The young bourgeoisie was consequently compelled to sustain a great and complex ideological struggle, which the literature presents as a struggle for the freedom of thought, but which in fact represented the superstructure of a fierce conflict between two forces which were organized to defeat one another. Today, world capitalism, in addition to the church and schools, commands an endless number of other forms of ideological manipulation and countless methods for forming a so-called consciousness. It has surpassed the old regimes, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in the fabrication of falsehoods and deceits. This is true not only in that it broadcasts the most absurd doctrines and superstitions, but also in that it informs the masses in a totally false way about the countless events of complex modern life. In spite of this tremendous arsenal of our class enemy, we have always maintained that within the oppressed class, an antagonistic ideology and doctrine would form, and would achieve a greater and greater clarity as the economic development itself sharpens the conflict between the productive forces and the relations of production. and as the fierce struggle between different class interests spreads. This perspective is not founded on the argument that given the fact that the proletarians outnumber the bourgeois, the sum total of their individual views and conceptions would prevail over that of the enemy due to their greater numerical weight. We have always maintained that this clarity and consciousness is not realized in an amorphous mass of isolated individuals. It is realized instead in organizations which emerge from the undifferentiated mass, in resolute minorities who join together beyond national boundaries, following the line of the general historical continuity of the movement. These minorities assume the function of leading the struggle of the masses. The greater part of the masses, on the other hand, are pushed into this struggle by economic factors, well before they develop the same strength and clarity of ideas that is crystallized in the guiding party. This is why a count of the votes cast by the entire working class mass, supposing such a thing were possible, would not exclude an outcome favorable to the counter-revolution, even in a situation which would be conducive to a forward advance and a struggle under the leadership of the vanguard minority. Even a general and widespread political struggle, which ends with the victorious conquest of power, is not sufficient for the immediate elimination of the whole complex of traditional influences of bourgeois ideology. The latter not only continues to survive throughout the whole social structure within the country of the victorious revolution itself, but continues to act from outside with a massive deployment of all the modern means of propaganda of which we have spoken before. It is, of course, of great advantage to break the state machinery, to destroy all the old structures for the systematic fabrication of bourgeois ideology, such as the church, the school, and the other countless associations, and to take control over all the major means of diffusing ideas, such as the press, the radio, the theaters, etc. However, all this is not enough. It must be completed by a socio-economic condition, the rapid and successful eradication of the bourgeois form of production. Lenin was well aware that the necessity of permitting the continued existence, and in a certain sense the flourishing, of the family management of the small peasant farms meant that a whole area would be left open to the influence of the selfish and mercantile bourgeois psychology, to the anti-revolutionary propaganda of the priest, and in short to the play of countless counter-revolutionary superstitions. The unfavorable relationship of forces, however, left no other choice. Only in conserving the force, strength, and firmness of the armed power of the industrial proletariat was it possible to make use of the revolutionary impetus of the peasant allies against the shackles of the agrarian feudal regime, and at the same time guard against the danger of a possible revolt by the middle peasants, such as occurred during the Civil War against Denikin and Kolchak. The erroneous position of those who want to see the application of arithmetic democracy within the working class, or within certain class organizations, can be traced back to a false appreciation of the Marxist determinism. We have already shown that it is incorrect to believe that in each historical period, each of the opposing classes has corresponding groups which profess theories opposed to the other classes. Instead, the correct thesis is that in each historical epoch, the doctrinal system based on the interests of the ruling class tend to be professed by the oppressed class, much to the advantage of the former. He who is a slave in the body is also a slave in the mind. The old bourgeois lie is precisely to pretend that we must begin with the liberation of the intellect, a method which leads to nothing and costs nothing for the privileged class, while instead we must start with the physical liberation of the body. It is also erroneous to establish the following determinist progression with respect to the famous problem of consciousness, influence of economic factors, class consciousness, class action. The progression instead is the reverse, determining economic factors, class action, class consciousness. Consciousness comes at the end, and, as a rule, after the decisive victory. Economic necessity unites and binds the pressure and energy of all those who are oppressed and suffocated by the forms of a given productive system. The oppressed react, they fight, they hurl themselves against these limits. In the course of this clash and this battle, they increasingly develop an understanding of the general conditions of the struggle, as well as its laws and principles, and a clear comprehension of the program of the struggling class develops. For decades we have been reproached for wanting a revolution carried out by those who are unconscious. We could answer that provided that the revolution sweeps away the mass of horrors created by the bourgeois regime, and provided that the terrible encirclement of the productive masses by bourgeois institutions which oppress and suffocate them is broken. Then it would not bother us in the least if the decisive blows were delivered even by those who are not yet conscious of the aim of the struggle. Instead, we left Marxists have always clearly and emphatically insisted on the importance of the theoretical side of the working class movement, and we consequently have constantly denounced the absence of principles and the betrayal of these by the right-wing opportunists. We have always maintained the validity of the Marxist conception, which considers the proletariat even as the true inheritor of modern classical philosophy. Let us explain. The struggle of the bourgeois usurers, colonial settlers, and merchants was paralleled by an attack by the critical method against the dogmas of the Church and the ideology of the authority of divine right. There was a revolution which appeared to be completed in natural philosophy before it was completed in society. This resulted from the fact that, of those forms which had to be destroyed in order for the capitalist productive forces to develop, the scholastic and theocratic ideological system of the Middle Ages was a relevant one. However, after its political and social victory, the bourgeoisie became conservative. It had no interest in directing the weapon of the critique, which it had used against the lies of the Christian cosmology, to the area of the much more pressing and human problem of the social structure. This second task in the evolution of the theoretical consciousness of society fell to a new class, which was pushed by its own interests to lay bare the lies of bourgeois civilization. This new class, in the powerful dialectical vision of Marx, was the class of the wretched artisans, excluded from culture in the Middle Ages and supposedly elevated to a position of legal equality by the Liberal Revolution. It was the class of manual laborers of big industry, uneducated and all but illiterate. The key to our conception lies precisely in the fact that we do not consider the seat of consciousness to be the narrow area of the individual person, and that we well know that, generally speaking, the elements of the mass who are pushed into struggle cannot possess in their minds the general theoretical outlook. To require such a condition would be purely illusory and counter-revolutionary. Neither does this task of possessing the theoretical consciousness fall to a band or group of superior individuals whose mission is to help humanity. It falls instead to an organism, to a mechanism differentiated within the mass, utilizing the individual elements as cells that compose the tissue and elevating them to a function made possible only by this complex of relationships. This organism, this system, this complex of elements, each with its own function, analogous to the animal organism with its extremely complicated systems of tissues, networks, vessels, etc., is the class organism, the party, which in a certain way defines the class before itself and gives it the capacity to make its own history. This whole process is reflected in the most diverse ways on the different individuals who statistically belong to the class. To be more specific, we would not be surprised to find side by side, in a given situation, the revolutionary and conscious worker, the worker who is still a total victim of the conservative political influences and who perhaps even marches in the ranks of the enemy, the worker who follows the opportunist currents of the movement, etc. And we would have no conclusions to automatically draw from a vote among the working class that would indicate how many members of the class are numerically distributed on these various positions, assuming that such a vote was actually possible. It is only too well established that the class party, both before and after the conquest of power, is susceptible of degeneration in its function as a revolutionary instrument. It is necessary to search both for the causes of this serious phenomenon of social pathology and for the means to fight it. However, it only follows from what has been said above that the method of voting cannot guarantee in any way the correctness of the party's orientation and directives, regardless of whether this voting is done by militants of the party or by a much wider circle encompassing the workers who belong to the unions, the factory organizations, or even the representative organs of a political nature, such as the Soviets or workers' councils. The history of the working class movement shows concretely that such a method has never led to any good and has never prevented the disastrous victories of opportunism. In all the conflicts between tendencies within the traditional socialist parties before World War I, the right-wing revisionists always argued against the radical Marxists of the left that they, the right wing, were much more closely tied to the wide strata of the working class than the narrow circles of the leadership of the political party. The opportunist currents had their main support in the parliamentary leaders of the party, who disobeyed the party's political directives and demanded a free hand to collaborate with the bourgeois parties. They did so under the pretext that they had been elected by the mass of proletarian voters who far outnumbered the proletarians who belonged to the party and elected the party's political leadership. The union leaders who belonged to the party practiced the same collaboration on the union level as the parliamentary leaders did on the political level. They refused the discipline of the class party, using the justification that they represented all the unionized workers who greatly outnumbered the party's militants. In their haste to ally with capitalism, something which culminated in their support for the First Imperialist War, neither the parliamentary possibilists nor the union bonzes hesitated, in the name of the workerism and laborism they proudly flaunted, to deride those groups who brought forwards the true class politics within the party, and to brand these groups as intellectuals, and sometimes even as non-proletarians. The history of Sorelian syndicalism also shows that the method of direct representation of the rank-and-file worker does not have leftist results and does not lead to the preservation of a truly revolutionary orientation. At a certain period, this school of anarcho-syndicalism had seemed to some to be a true alternative to the degeneration of the Social Democratic Party, which had taken the road of renouncing direct action and class violence. The Marxist groups which later converged in the Leninist reconstruction of the Third International rightly criticized and condemned this seemingly radical orientation. They denounced it for abandoning the only unifying class method which could surmount the narrowness of the individual trade and of everyday conflict limited to economic demands. Even if physically violent means of struggle were used, this orientation led to the denial of the position of revolutionary Marxism, because for Marxism every class struggle is a political struggle, and the indispensable instrument of the struggle is the party. The justness of this theoretical polemic was confirmed by the fact that even revolutionary syndicalism sank in the crisis of the war and passed into the ranks of social patriotism in the various countries. As concerns the lesson we can draw from party action immediately after the revolutionary victory, the major episodes of the Russian Revolution are those able to shed the greatest light on the issue we're dealing with. We reject the critique which claims that the disastrous degeneration of Leninist revolutionary politics into the present Stalinist policies was brought about in the beginning by the excessive predominance of the party and its central committee over the other working-class organizations. We reject the illusory viewpoint that the whole degenerative process could have been contained if a vote among the various base organizations had been used as the means to decide both the makeup of the hierarchy and the major changes in the politics of the proletarian state. The problem of the degeneration cannot be approached without connecting it to the question of the socio-economic role of the various organisms in the process of destruction of the old economy and of construction of the new one. Unions undoubtedly constitute, and for a long period have constituted, a fundamental struggle ground in the development of the revolutionary energies of the proletariat. But this has been possible with success only when the class party has carried on a serious work within the unions in order to shift the concentration of energy from narrow intermediate objectives to a general class aims. The trade union, even as it evolved into the industrial union, finds limits to its dynamics because within it there exist different interests between the various categories and groups of workers. There are even greater limits to its actions as capitalist society and the capitalist state pass through the three successive historical phases: the prohibition of trade organizations and strikes, the toleration of autonomous trade organizations, and finally the conquest of the trade unions and their imprisonment in the bourgeois system. Even under a solidly established proletarian dictatorship, the union cannot be considered as an organ which represents the workers in a fundamental and stable way. In this social period, conflicts between the various trades and the working class can still exist. The basic point is that the workers only have reason to make use of the union as long as the working class power is compelled to tolerate, in certain sections, the temporary presence of employers. With the disappearance of the latter due to the advance of socialist development, all content of union action is lost. Our conception of socialism is not the substitution of the state boss for the private boss. However, if the relationship were such in the transition period, then in the supreme interest of revolutionary politics, it could not be admitted as a principle that the employer state must always give in to the economic pressure of the workers' unions. We won't go further in this important analysis, for at this point we have already sufficiently explained why we left communists do not admit that the unionized mass would be allowed to exert an influence on revolutionary politics through a majority vote. Now let us consider the factory councils. We must remember that this form of economic organization, which at first appeared to be much more radical than the union, is increasingly losing its pretense of revolutionary dynamism. Today, the idea of factory councils is common to all political currents, even the fascists. The conception of factory councils as an organization which participates first in the supervising and later the management of production, and in the end which is capable of taking over, factory by factory, the management of production in its totality, has proven to be totally collaborationist. It has proven to be another way, no less effective than the old syndicalism, of preventing the masses from being channeled in the direction of the great united and centralized struggle for power. The polemic over this question caused a great stir in the young communist parties when the Russian Bolsheviks were compelled to take firm and even drastic measures to combat the workers' tendency towards autonomous, technical, and economic management of the factories in which they worked. Such an autonomous management not only impeded the onset of a true socialist plan, but also threatened of seriously harming the efficiency of the production apparatus, something the counter-revolutionaries were counting on. As a matter of fact, the factory council, even more so than the union, can act as a representative of very narrow interests which can come into conflict with the general class interests. Consequently, the factory councils also cannot be considered as a basic and definitive organ of the working class state. When a true communist economy is established in certain sectors of production and circulation, that is to say, when we have gone far beyond the simple expulsion of the capitalist owner from industry and the management of the enterprise by the state, then it would be precisely the enterprise economy that will disappear. Once we have gone beyond the mercantilist form of production, the local plant will only be a technical node in the great network, rationally managed by a unitary plan. The firm will no longer have a balance sheet of income and expenditures. Consequently, it will no longer be a firm at all, and the producer will no longer be a wage laborer. Thus, the factory council, like the union, has natural limits of functioning which prevent it from being, until the end of the revolutionary process, the real field for class preparation, to make the proletarians able and willing to struggle until the complete achievement of their final goal. This is the reason why these economic organizations cannot be a body which oversees the party holding state power and which judges whether or not the party has strayed from its fundamental historical line. It remains for us to examine the new organism which was brought to life by the Russian Revolution. This was the workers, peasants, and, at the beginning, soldiers' Soviet. Some claim that this system represented a new proletarian constitutional form counterposed to the traditional constitutional forms of the bourgeois state. The Soviet system reached from the smallest village to the highest bodies of the state through successive horizontal strata. Furthermore, it had the two following characteristics. 1. It excluded all elements of the old propertied classes, in other words, it was the organizational manifestation of the proletarian dictatorship, and 2. It concentrated all representative, executive, and, in theory, even judicial powers in its nerve centers. It has been said that because of these characteristics, the Soviet system is a perfect mechanism of internal class democracy which, once discovered, would eclipse the traditional parliaments of bourgeois liberalism. However, since the emergence of socialism from its utopian phase, every Marxist has known that the intervention of a constitutional form is not enough to distinguish the great social forms and the great historical epochs. The constitutional structures are transitory reflections of the relationship of forces. They are not derived from universal principles on which we could deduce an inherent mode of state organization. Soviets, in their essence, are actual class organizations, and are not, as some believed, conglomerations of trade or craft organizations. Consequently, they do not suffer from the narrowness of the purely economic organization. For us, their importance lies above all in the fact that they are organs of struggle. We do not try to view them in terms of ideal structural models, but in terms of the history of their real development. Thus, it was a decisive moment in the Russian Revolution when, shortly after the election of the democratic-type Constituent Assembly, the Soviets rose up against the latter as its dialectical opposite, and Bolshevik power dissolved the Parliamentary Assembly by force. This was the realization of the brilliant historical watchword, "All power to the Soviets." However, all this was not sufficient for us to accept the idea that once such a form of class representation is born, and leaving aside here the fluctuations, in every sense, of its representative composition, which we are not able to examine here, a majority vote, at whatever moment and turn in the difficult struggle waged by the revolution both domestically and externally, is a reliable and easy method for solving every question and even avoiding the counter-revolutionary degeneration. We must admit that the Soviet system, due to the very complexity of its historical evolutionary cycle, which incidentally must end, in the most optimistic hypothesis, with the disappearance of the Soviets along with the withering away of the state, is susceptible of falling under counter-revolutionary influence, just as it is susceptible of being a revolutionary instrument. In conclusion, we do not believe that there is any constitutional form which can immunize us against such a danger. The only guarantee, if any, lies in the development of the domestic and international relations of social forces. Since we want to establish the supremacy of the party, which includes only a minority of the class, over the other forms of organization, it could be possible for someone to object that we seem to think that the party is eternal, in other words, that it will survive the withering away of the state, of which Engels spoke. Here we do not want to go into a discussion on the future transformation of the party. Just as the state, in the Marxist definition, withers away and is transformed, from a political apparatus of coercion into a larger and always more rational technical administration, so the party evolves into a simple organization for social research and study, corresponding to large institutions for scientific research in the new society. The distinctive characteristic of the party follows from its organic nature. One does not join the party because one has a particular position in the economic or social structure. No one is automatically a party militant because he is a proletarian, a voter, a citizen, etc. Jurists would say that one joins the party by free individual initiative. We Marxists say otherwise. One joins the party always due to factors born out of relationships of social environment. But these factors can be linked in a more general way to the characteristics of the class party, to its presence in all parts of the inhabited world, to the fact that it is made up of workers of all trades and enterprises, and, in principle, even of those who are not workers, and to the continuity of its work through the successive stages of propaganda, organization, physical combat, seizure of power, and the construction of a new order. Out of all the proletarian organizations, it is consequently the political party which least suffers from these structural and functional limits which enable the anti-proletarian influences, the germs which cause the disease of opportunism, to force their way in. We have said many times, though, that this danger also exists for the party. The conclusion that we draw is not that it can be warded off by subordinating the party to the other organizations of that class which the party represents, a subordination which is often demanded under false pretexts, other times simply out of naivete, with the reason that a greater number of workers belong to other class organizations. Our way to interpret this question also concerns the supposed necessity of internal party democracy. We do not deny that there unfortunately have been numerous and disastrous examples of errors committed by the central leadership of the communist parties. However, can these errors be avoided through computing the opinions of the rank-and-file militants? We do not attribute the degeneration which took place in the Communist Party to the fact that the assemblies and congresses of the militants had little voice with respect to the initiatives taken by the center. At many historical turning points, we have seen the rank-and-file smothered by the center for counter-revolutionary purposes. To this end, even the instruments of the state machine, including the most brutal, have been employed. But all this is not the origin of the degeneration of the party, but an inevitable manifestation of it, a sign that the party has yielded to counter-revolutionary influences. The position of the Italian communist left on what we could call the question of revolutionary guarantees is first of all that no constitutional or contractual provision can protect the party against degeneration, even though the party, as opposed to other organizations we have studied, has the characteristics of a contractual organization, and we use the term not as it is used in jurisprudence, nor even as it was used by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The relationship between the militant and the party is based on a commitment, and our conception of this commitment, which avoids the undesirable adjective contractual, we may define simply as dialectical. It is a dual relationship which flows both ways, from the center to the base, and from the base to the center. If the action of the center goes in accordance with the good functioning of the dialectical relationship, it is met by healthy responses from the base. The celebrated problem of discipline thus consists in setting a system of limitations on rank-and-file militants, which is a proper reflection of the limitations set on the action of the leadership. Consequently, we have always maintained that the leadership must not have the right, in the great turning points in the political situation, to discover, invent, and impose pretendedly new principles, new formulations, and new guidelines for the action of the party. These sudden shifts make up the shameful history of opportunist betrayals. When such a crisis occurs, precisely because the party is not a short-term, reactive organization, an internal struggle ensues, tendencies form, splits occur, and in such cases these serve a useful purpose, like the fever which frees an organism of disease, but which nevertheless, constitutionally, one cannot admit, encourage, or tolerate. Thus, there are no rules or recipes that can be applied to prevent the party from succumbing to crises of opportunism, or necessarily having to react to them with fractionalism. There is, however, the experience of the proletarian struggle over many decades, which allows us to identify certain conditions, the study, defense, and realization of which must be the indefatigable task of our movement. We indicate in conclusion the main ones. 1. The party must defend and affirm the maximum clarity and continuity of the communist doctrine, which has been extrapolated in its successive applications to historical developments, and must not consent to proclamations of principle that run counter, even partially, to its fundamental theoretical principles. 2. The party must in each historical situation openly proclaim the entire content of its program with regards to how to realize it economically, socially, and politically, and above all as regards the question of power, its conquest by armed force, and its exercise through the dictatorship. Dictatorships that degenerate to the benefit of a limited circle of bureaucrats and praetorians have always been preceded by ideological proclamations that are hypocritically masked under formulas of a populist nature, whether democratic or national, and under the pretext of having the broad popular masses behind them. The Revolutionary Party, on the other hand, does not hesitate to declare its intention to attack the state and its institutions, and to hold the defeated class under the despotic weight of the dictatorship, even when it admits that only an advanced minority of the oppressed class has been able to understand this requirement of the struggle. The communists, says the manifesto, disdain to conceal their views and aims. Only renegades from communism boast of achieving them, while keeping them cunningly disguised. 3. The party must effect a strict organizational rigor in the sense that it does not accept self-enlargement by means of compromises with other groups, large or small, or worse still through bargaining over concessions with alleged bosses and leaders in order to win rank-and-file members. 4. The party must struggle for a clear historical comprehension of the basic antagonism that underlies the struggle. Communists claim the initiative in leading the assault against an entire world of structures and traditions. They know they constitute a danger for the privileged as a whole, and call on the masses to embark on an offensive struggle, and not a defensive one, against the alleged dangers of losing so-called benefits and advancements conquered within the capitalist world. Communists do not rent out nor lend out their party to take remedial actions in defense of causes that are not their own, and of non-proletarian objectives such as freedom, the fatherland, democracy, and other such lies. The workers know they have nothing to lose in the struggle except their chains. 5. Communists renounce the entire spectrum of tactical expedients which have been invoked on the back of demands to accelerate the adherence of broad layers of the masses to the revolutionary program. These expedients are the political compromise, alliances with other parties, the United Front, and various formulas regarding the state used as a substitute for the proletarian dictatorship, workers' and peasants' government, popular government, progressive democracy. Communists recognize that historically one of the main conditions for the dissolution of the proletarian movement and of the Soviet communist regime lay precisely in the use of these tactical methods, and they consider those who deplore the opportunist plague of the Stalinist movement, yet at the same time advocate this tactical paraphernalia to be more dangerous enemies than the self-same Stalinists. Postscript. The work, Force, Violence, and Dictatorship in the Class Struggle, which we have published in 5 parts, dealt with the question of the use of force in social relationships and the characteristics of the revolutionary dictatorship according to the correct Marxist interpretation. It intentionally did not dwell on the issue of class and party organization. However, in the final part of the discussion on the causes of the degeneration of the dictatorship, we were led straight to this point, since many people have attributed such degeneration to errors in internal organization and to the violation of a democratic and elective process within both the party and the other class organizations. In refuting this thesis, however, we have neglected to mention an important polemic which took place in the Communist International in 1925-26 on the subject of changing the organizational base of the Communist Party to factory cells or factory nuclei. The Italian left was practically alone in resolutely opposing this change and in insisting that the organizational base must remain territorial. This position was exhaustively expounded at the time, however the central point was this: The organic function of the party, a function which no other organization can fill, is to lead the struggle from the level of the individual economic struggle on the local and trade basis to the united, general proletarian class struggle which is social and political. Such a task, consequently, cannot be seriously undertaken by an organizational unit which includes only workers of the same trade or concern. This milieu will only be receptive to narrow trade interests. The central directives of the party will seem as something coming from above, something foreign, and the party officials will never meet with the rank and file on an equal footing, and in a certain sense they will no longer belong to the party, since they are not employed by a concern. Territorial groups by nature, however, place workers of every trade and workers employed by different employers on the same level, as well as the other militants from social strata which are not strictly proletarian, and the party openly accepts the latter as rank-and-file members, and initially only as rank-and-file members, if necessary keeping them in quarantine for some time before calling them, if such a thing is warranted, to organizational positions. It had been claimed that the factory cell would provide a closer link between the party organization and the great masses. However, we demonstrated at the time that the concept of factory cells contained the same opportunist and demagogic defects as right-wing workerism and laborism, and counterposed the party officials to the rank and file in an out-and-out caricature of Lenin's conception of professional revolutionaries. The left replaced the idiotic majoritary criterion, which is copied after bourgeois democracy, with a higher, dialectical criterion which hinges everything on the solid link of both the rank-and-file militants and the leadership to the strict and obligatory continuity of theory, program, and tactics. It rejected any idea of demagogically wooing those wide layers of the masses which are so easily maneuverable. The left's conception of the organization of the party is, in reality, the only one which can provide protection against the bureaucratic degeneration of the leading strata of the party and against the overpowering of the party's rank and file by such leadership, both of which lead to a situation where the enemy class gains a devastating influence.